I recently started my journey in therapy, and I have learned so much during such a short period of time that I thought it was really important to make We Heart Our Lives' first episode focused on how important therapy is. So I invited a mental health expert, Kamilyah, to our set to talk to us a little bit about mental wellness and suicidality. Before we dive right in, Kamilyah, I would love for you to just kind of like tell everybody what you do and about your background, especially in what your focus is.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I'm a talk-based clinician. So I work with people on a host of things, including trauma, relational trauma, attachment issues, but it's primarily talk-based therapy.
Okay, and what would you say is the current landscape, especially when it comes to mental wellness and suicidality?
I think that we have come such a long way in that people are comfortable. Like, look at you, we're here talking about this. This is amazing.
It took a lot of years before I could build up the courage, but
I know this is awesome. People like you are doing such great work in doing this. There's more celebrities being open. I say celebrities just because they're like known people. And I think people, like the whole wellness community in itself has taken off, and a large part of that is mental health. The flip side of that coin is that I think we have such a long way still to go, because there's still a lot of stigma.
Absolutely.
There's still a lot of judgment just based on fear and a little bit of ignorance and about suicide and how it affects communities of color. So on one hand, it's like this is like such a great place to be in, but we still have some work to do. Like in 2017, there were twice as many people who died by suicide than homicides in the U.S. And so that's such a huge number. 50% of people living in the U.S. know someone who has died by suicide.
We understand and know that every 40 seconds somebody commits suicide around the world.
Yeah.
And that number is just starkly scary
and shocking,
you know. And I think, you know, it's such an epidemic and we don't talk about it enough. There's so much taboo around it that we don't feel comfortable enough to come out and say, hey,
Absolutely.
I have suicidal ideations.
Absolutely.
I'm depressed.
Right.
And so what is your perspective within that?
So I think what's great about being here in 2019 is that people are more open to having conversations. There used to be a focus just on conversation with people like only mental health world or people who are seeking services, but now more and more people speak about wellness and wellness in particular, and part of being well for a lot of people is doing like self-care, but self-care can also be mental health. And so I think that is something so great about being where we're at today. However, there is still so much stigma. Even in like my personal, maybe my family, I'm like, oh, you know, therapy. And they're like, oh, but there's nothing wrong. You know, you don't need therapy, or people don't need therapy. There's nothing wrong with you. And I think there's still that stigma around like there has to be something wrong to like seek therapy. So we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go.
Can you describe what a session would be like when you come and see a wellness professional or mental health professional?
Something that was like really, really cool that a client said to me recently was that when she first started coming to therapy, she thought it was about like the big stuff that happened to her. But over time, she's realized it's like the little everyday things.
The little things that
keep her
pile
coming.
up, right?
Exactly.
Through your experience and when you have these sessions, what is the comparison that you've kind of like seen between depression and suicidality, and do they even go together?
That's a good question. So yes and no. Depression and suicidality can be related in that people who are depressed may often feel like they want to kill themselves. That's just like the reality of it. However, you can have depression and not have any suicidal thoughts or ideation, and you can also not have depression and have suicidal thoughts or ideation. So they can go together, but sometimes they don't necessarily have to.
You know, and I think it's so important to stress that, because a lot of times people are looking out for signs for people that are suicidal based on if they're looking good or whatever their depressive state is, if they're fun and happy. And you're like, well, I didn't even see it coming. There was no signs. I couldn't tell. I wanted to kind of like jump into that and hear your perspective of, as far as like what you've seen. Yeah. What are some of the signs that are there when you are depressed and suicidal, and like what are the differences?
So I think we have to start by saying like depression doesn't look like any one thing. There are symptoms that we as mental health clinicians can identify and diagnose people with depression, but that doesn't look like one particular thing. And depression in people of color looks completely different than it does.
How so?
And so like people often think of depression as like not being able to get out of bed, or having like a low desire, or not having any interest in things, which absolutely can be true. But when you are living below or at the poverty line, sometimes even getting out of bed, as much as it's a struggle, you still have to do it because you have to feed your family, you have to go to work. Also, depression can look like anger in some people. And so if you're a person or woman of color, a black woman or a black man, that may be the way that the depression exhibits, or your coping skills may just be angry or apathy. And people think that you just don't care about things, but that could be signs of depression. So I think learning about the differences in cultures and how it looks in different people is helpful for people to be diagnosed.
And that's a key word, especially because we're individuals, we experience pain, and our coping mechanisms are completely different.
Exactly.
However, I know people, it's such a daunting aspect to not be able to identify traits within somebody's suffering. Do you have like a baseline of what we could look for or be aware of when we have somebody that we know could be suicidal?
Yeah, I think I would say a baseline would just be to like name it. And so like, even though everyone's different, even though I may not have like exactly what works for like 5 different people, I think I would just say like asking someone like, hey, are you okay? Hey, do you feel like hurting yourself? I think people think if they name it and introduce it to someone, it gives them the idea. And the reality of it is people may be thinking about suicide or have suicide ideation since they were little, since they were young, and they've dealt with it for 25 or 30 years. And that's just a constant, that's just their baseline. So just naming it and saying it, and I think if people became more comfortable with it, then those conversations could happen. But I would say things like having loss of interest in certain things. I don't even want to say being withdrawn, because like you said, people can be happy and like show you that they're happy, and they can still have those thoughts. And I think even recently, for the past few years, we've had a lot of examples of that through famous people that, you know, no one would see it coming just because of the representation, or how they present rather, but they still are dealing with that every day. So I think just naming it and like being there for people and letting them know that they can come talk to you, and then also recognizing when you as a layperson, so to speak, not a mental health clinician, you have a line and you can't be helpful anymore, or you can't be useful anymore.
Can we even talk about just that aspect of things? Because I think, you know, one, I think it's really helpful to your point, to name something, right? Yeah. And having the person that's suffering being okay to have a conversation with you. I think for me, it's been very tough to, if I want to just talk about how I feel, people are like, oh, don't say that. Yeah. Like, don't dare go. Why would you think that? Do you know what it would do to us?
And that's so shaming also, you know?
So shaming. Yeah. And that just means that now I'm more isolated. There are less people I can talk. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I do know that there is a certain, you know, cadence that you have a conversation with to allow somebody to express exactly how they're feeling. And then there's that gray area of like, when is it time to bring in a mental health professional, or when is it time to call the cops?
Yeah. So before we even talk about that, like, I want to recognize that, you know, I'm a Black woman living in America, and so calling law enforcement is very dangerous that danger is very real for a lot of people. And so I want to just recognize that, because that's just so real and every day in our existence, right? How you, as just like someone who is helping someone, could be there for them besides naming it and addressing it. And even if that person doesn't agree or say like, I've been feeling this way, just saying like, it's okay if you have been, just to let that person know that you're safe. So if someone, you know, maybe said that to you, then you wouldn't have felt shame, or you wouldn't have felt, you know, even more isolated. And then I would just say continue to check in and just let people know, like, I'm just checking in because I'm concerned about you, I'm worried about you. And then I think and this is like you said, there's that gray area and everyone's different, if it gets worse in that, I would ask a person like, okay, so if you were thinking about this, like, how often are you thinking about it? If it becomes more progressive and it's like more intruding into their daily lives, how we as clinicians usually do things are we like ask if there's a plan. So, you know, people can have mild or like low level suicidal ideation every day and it's constant, but when it starts being, okay, I can't stop thinking about this, or I can't even like, I used to be able to like watch a TV show and wouldn't have those thoughts, or like go have a nice meal, or like whatever, or go work out. But when those things aren't working, so like when you're just coping skills that you've come up with for yourself aren't working anymore, and then when it becomes more progressive, and then when you start thinking about a plan, I would say immediately getting a mental health professional involved, calling a hotline. And then unfortunately, if someone is like has a plan and determined to put that plan into action, then you would have to get someone else involved, and hopefully that's like a non-emergency police, or like even calling like there's mobile crisis units that come.
I never knew that.
Yeah, so New York, and I'm pretty sure every state has them, but don't quote me on that. But there's mobile crisis that comes and does assessments and can take people to the hospital without getting law enforcement involved.
But what should you absolutely not do when somebody is suicidal?
I think it's such a great question. I even kind of like it more than like what should you do, because what should you do varies on the person, but there's like some just straight up what you should not do for everyone. So shame. Like, don't shame anyone. I think you mentioned before, like, people are like, oh, why are you suicidal? Like,
right.
Again, that question puts people on the defensive, and then doesn't take into understanding, like, what that person could be going through, what suffering they could be going through, and how suicidal ideation, suicidality is a very real part of their coping skills.
Right.
So shaming people, again, being afraid to, like, mention it and call it what it is. There's nothing wrong with saying the word suicide. There's nothing wrong with saying, like, do you feel like hurting yourself or even killing yourself? There's no shame in that. And you saying that to someone is not going to magically put the idea in their head. And it's just giving them time and a space to be honest with you, right?
Absolutely.
There's also, what you shouldn't do is, like, say, you have so much to live for. You have all this going on for you. Or, like just, meditate or pray or like all those things that we hear.
Go take a nap.
Right? Go take a nap. Like, we should not assume based on anyone's presentation of their life or just knowing them that we know what's happening with them and that they have a reason to not feel this way, because that again is stigmatizing.
Right.
And that's just not allowing them to be real and to be honest. And it's also minimizing their suffering. Again, there's nothing wrong with how you're feeling. There's nothing wrong with even feeling things that maybe other people don't talk about feeling or experiencing. And to also give yourself that grace and give yourself that permission to acknowledge that, to lean into like why that's happening. So I think the first step is like acknowledging it, admitting that that's okay, and learning that that's okay, and then, like you said, working backwards, figuring out, okay, like, why is it?
So to your point, important to see somebody and be able to talk about it, name it, claim it, take it as a part, take it as a part of yourself, and really understand that it's not all of me.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
It's
a part of you.
Sometimes we, if you are suffering, we don't want to put, the burden on everybody else. I think something that was been really helpful to learn is to pinpoint my own triggers.
Yeah.
I think that was something new that I learned, because I didn't know. I thought it was random and sporadic. Like everybody that if you have depression, if something, because every time somebody asked me, it's like, why are you suicidal? It was always like, what happened? What was the
even
instant?
That question, like, why are you suicidal? That you could put someone on the defense.
Of course.
It's like, this.
Of course.
That's the way your brain works. That's
Or like I have no reason to feel the way that I feel, so I'm invalidated. My feelings and emotions and what I'm going through isn't valid, so that makes me even more down. Like, what is wrong with me? You know what I mean? And it becomes a spiral.
Absolutely.
And I think I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about identifying triggers within your own being, in your wellness process.
Yeah. So you and I had this conversation actually about that, and even trauma, how it's stored in the body. So I think those two things are closely related for me, because most people are triggered by something that they've been traumatized, about or with. Oftentimes, like, we don't remember certain traumas. Like, our brains are really powerful and magical in that way, and that they really have a way of hiding certain things from us, so we can function and can cope. But then triggers occur when things like that, where you don't necessarily remember them. It's really like slowing down and taking note of like your body's reaction. I would say definitely just like making notes of things after, of course, the anxiety is over, or even talking to someone about like, hey, this weird thing happened to me today, and having someone help you explore surrounding like what will happen.
Absolutely. I loved when you spoke about, especially body scanning. I'm super interested to kind of like learn more about, the studies and how it can be helpful for anybody at home to kind of like tap into that.
Yeah, I think we oftentimes, I think in a push to like talk about coping skills and wellness, we oftentimes want to like identify it's whatever feeling is, so it's anxiety or depression, and then work through it, or like come up with coping skills to like mitigate it. But now we're realizing that working through it and kind of leaning into it a little bit is helpful, because we're able to identify like, okay, so how and why did this happen? And so before it was just like, okay, let's push through it and like kind of ignore it and work on like the symptoms of it, which is also great, but you have to also figure out like why something happened.
Right.
So if you're just pushing through and not figuring out why it happened, then it's not really helpful. So body scanning is like a perfect way of doing that.
Do you think that in itself gives you power back?
Absolutely.
Because you can identify it and you can make a plan.
Yeah.
Almost.
In my work, I often, say to myself, like, I could be the people I'm working with. I think it's really difficult, like, when something happens, it's like happening to your body, but you can't explain it. That is so freaking scary. Like, I can't imagine, like, if something happens and it's like, why am I dealing with this? This happened suddenly. I wasn't paying attention to before. Like, and all of a sudden this happened, but I can't explain why. And so I think body scanning is a way to like own like become back in control of like your body and own like what's happening to you. Talking about it with people, naming it even, and saying like, yes, I've been dealing with this for forever, but like that's my stuff, and like that's okay too. Again, the stigma is like, you think that you're so uncomfortable and like you don't want to talk about it or just address it, but like just being real and honest with people is so helpful.
It's a weight off your shoulders.
Yeah.
And I think that is, the core of our mission is to eliminate isolation during those times.
Absolutely.
Because if you see that you're not alone and that you're not the only one having these feelings, maybe, just maybe, you understand that you're not an alien.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with you. Yeah.
I just want to say thank you so much, Kamilyah Cooper, for being here with us today and having this very important conversation with us. I think it's imperative to have these open dialogues
Absolutely.
and be able to openly and honestly talk about our issues. With that said, for more information, visit our website at www.weheartourlives.com and learn more about our mission to lower the suicide rate worldwide.